Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Welcome to the March episode of the Forest Health Workshop Series presented by the South Dakota Department of Natural Resources, Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources. I'll get it right one of these days. I'm your MC, Tony Seidel, Forest Health Program Coordinator. We're joined as always by your host, Dr. John Ball, Forest Health Specialist with the department and SDSU Extension Forester and Professor as well. Dr. Ball is going to talk today about tree planting as we're approaching the spring season. Don't get fooled by any of this warm weather. We're not out of the woods yet, but we will be there soon. So Dr. Ball will be discussing planting in the Dakotas, what you can expect for our climate up here in the northern Midwest. So our workshop is being recorded. This recording will be placed on the YouTube channel for the department once it's approved through the IT department. Usually it takes about 3 or 4 days, and then that'll be up for future viewing. We do have credentials for certified foresters and certified arborists. If you're a SAF certified forester, please put your credentials in the chat box. I'll make sure those get reported. If you're an ISA certified arborist, Dr. Ball will have a code for you at the end of this workshop. These credentials are just for your live viewing of today's workshop, not the recordings on the YouTube channel. So keep that in mind. Feel free to post any questions in the chat box. We'll make sure to have some time at the end to go through as many as possible. I'm sure there can be a lot of opinions and questions about planting, so I expect to see a few in the chat. But keep adding your locations in the chat box. I'd love to see where everybody's viewing in from. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Ball.
All right. Well, thanks, Tony. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I know it seems hard to talk about planting, considering what weather, at least in the eastern part of our area, is going to experience here this coming weekend and next Monday with perhaps a foot of snow in some areas. I'm not looking forward to that. I'm sure none of you are as well, but we do need the moisture. Well, today we're going to talk about planting, and the focus is going to be a lot on ornamental planting trees and shrubs in your community. Much of what I say is going to also apply if you say, well, John, I'm putting in a windbreak and I'm planting seedlings. And so we're not talking about that specifically, but some of the same concepts apply. So let's get into it. Well, most trees don't survive more than 10 or 17 years in the landscape, and it's often related to a problem at planting. And it's always tough to go to someone's house to look at a tree, our classic sick tree call that Tony and I both do, as well as the other service foresters in the South Dakota Department of Ag and Natural Resources. And you're looking at a tree that's been in the ground for 15 years, and you're telling them the reason the tree's dying is not because of an insect or disease. It was a mistake made at planting. So this is the one time you don't get any do-overs. If you plant it, you get to plant it once, and you got to do it right. So we're going to cover what I call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And what we're covering here are the 4 aspects of tree planting that you got to get right, and you got to get them right in order. And these are not matching the plant to the site, or planting a poor quality plant, or not planting it properly, or never taking care of it. Now, these are chronological order in the planting process. If you're looking at which of these 4 causes the highest mortality, it's actually number 3, improper planting. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on that one than we do the other 3, but let's get into it. First question, and this will be one we'll devote an entire session to, and that's what to plant and where. Too often people don't decide what to plant until they're at the garden center and then take a look at something and say, well, maybe this one. And let me give you the first bit of advice, and that is make sure when you read the tag, you look at how tall it gets and how wide it gets, and believe it. Too often we see plants that are forced into a smaller space than what they need to grow. And, you know, I've talked to the tree owner and they say, I never thought it would get this big. Well, none of us are surprised when that lab puppy gets big. Well, your trees will as well. And don't believe the ads. In the spring, we get a lot of them. You know, this is that super growing, flowering shade tree, roof high in just 1 year. If anyone tells you they've got a super tree, it's not for South Dakota. And we saw a lot of these ads, Sunday supplements and that, a number of years ago to go out and plant. It's the Royal Empress tree. And it will grow a foot tall in a season, but it's the same 8 feet from the ground because it dies to the ground. And every year I get people saying, well, I want to grow this or I want to grow that. Well, really, you got to move. And so just a couple of tips on matching the plant to the site. Remember your zone. We're in the USDA hardiness zone 4, which means our minimum January temperatures range between about -20 and -30. It doesn't mean every year, but we will hit those -30s, even those -35s in some locations. And you really want to make sure that the major trees that you're planting, the ones you don't want to have lost in one of those real cold winters, is rated to zone 4 or even better, zone 3, meaning you can grow them in North Dakota. And I know there's North Dakotans watching this as well. And for them, zone 3 is kind of critical. Now, in South Dakota, we have a few zone 5 spots at the very southern end of the state, down in the Yankton area along the river, and a little bit out in the Black Hills as well. And of course, if you're watching from Nebraska, you have a lot of zone 5 there in zone 6. But if you're in North Dakota, choosing trees that are hardy to zone 3 is really critical. In South Dakota, hardy to zone 4. For all your major landscape plants. Global warming is not going to change our minimum winter temperature. And so even though there's been some hype lately that the zone maps will be changing, they're really not going to be changing out here on the prairies, where our winters are dominated by extremes rather than just one cold day. The other map that you really need to start looking at is this heat sum map. Because guess what? Our warm summers can actually limit plant materials as well. And that also occurs to North Dakota because we're in a continental climate, hot summers and cold winters, the land of extremes. Now, if you ever look at a plant and it's got 2 lists, plant hardiness, and it'll have a zone 3 or 4, but a lot of labels are now coming with the heat sum number. And this is the number of days that you have temperatures above 86 degrees. And I'm showing you here part of South Dakota, and you can kind of look at the colors and get a look. Heat sum 5, heat sum 6, 7s in the map. But you can go online, and just like you can go online and look up the hardiness zone for your portion of the state, you can also look at the heat sum for the state as well, and that'll also be a number. Now, the interesting thing is that number can be important. And take a look at this tree. That's a balsam fir growing in Faith, South Dakota, which is West River for some folks that may not be familiar with it. And believe me, that tree is living just on Faith because it should not be there. Now, it'll tolerate as cold a weather as Faith will get. Okay. Its hardiness zone is zone 3. It'll easily take that. And you can always add water, even though it gets dry out there. What you can't do is change the summer heat. Now, this is best suited to heat sum zones 3, which means we get about 7 to 14 days of temperatures above 86 degrees. If you take a look at Faith, it's zone 7, 60 to 90 days. And the reason this tree isn't doing very well is not that it can't tolerate our winters. It cannot tolerate our summers. So for North Dakotans and South Dakotans, we also need to look at the heat sum zones, which you can find in catalogs and online, of course. But if you notice, you get a label on a plant and it has 2 numbers listed, one hardiness and one heat sum. Now you know the difference. And you want to make sure it's adapted to your summer heat as well as our winter cold. The other one, of course, is both the Dakotas do have problems with alkaline soils. And we've got to watch that as well. One of the things I always recommend is get a soil test before you decide what to plant. We have some trees, oaks, for example, not bur oak, but our other oaks that are very sensitive, such as the swamp white oak, and will become chlorotic. It'll have yellow leaves during the summertime if our pH is too high because it's not able to take up adequate amount of iron. And for our maples, particularly the red maples, some of our Freeman maples and silver maple, they're not able to take up iron or manganese in our high pH soils. Now, if you take a look, what we'd like to have is a neutral or slightly acidic soil. That's not found in the Dakotas very often, though we do have some neutral ones. But a lot of our urban ones are 7.4 to 7.8, and you're not going to be able to change that. So have a soil test done, at least know the pH of your soils, and make sure you choose trees that are adapted to that pH. And you'll find a lot of them will be. But I've seen some sites down near Chadron, Nebraska that are about 8.4 in Chadron. And I've even seen green ash become chlorotic. So you really got to be careful what you're planting. And again, it's the fact that our high pH, they're just not able to take up the iron or manganese that are in the soil. So merely adding more will not change that. Well, number 2 is poor plant quality. I hate to say it, but we're seeing more of this as of late. So make sure you're a good consumer and make sure you're buying plants that have been properly packaged and being sold. You can see here on these plants, they are a little shallow in the container there. We're already getting some dead branches. These would not be trees that I would want to buy at all. And trees like this one, these are some trees that were shipped into a community to plant. In other words, this was a community tree planting. And take a look at the scars on the trunk of that tree. That's not a good tree to start out with. In fact, it does not meet the standards, which requires the lower trunk of the tree not to have any wounds. A wound like that on a tree you just bought, no, that's one you don't buy. Or in this case, the community returned because there was no point in planting a tree that's going to fail on them. The trunk should be like this. Smooth, no wounds to it other than perhaps a pruning wound or two. And avoid trees that are too large for the container. Look at this. Here's a clue. If you buy a tree like that you can see the soil's only partway down the container and that trunk is very large for the pot, that was a bare root tree that a nursery put into a container and is now selling it to you as a container tree. Let me give you a very important term. It's called container growing. Container growing. That actually has meaning. If a nursery sells or says to you that these are container growing trees and it's in writing somewhere, that means that tree has always been in a container. Not the same one, perhaps. It kind of gets potted up, but that's a tree well adapted then. If it's a containerized tree, containerized, that means it was a bare root tree that somebody put in a container. And that's usually not a good buy, particularly in the spring of the year when it really hasn't been established. So again, your clue, the pot only has soil over half of it. The trunk looks awfully large for that pot. And by the way, you can literally shake it and it will move because it's a bare root tree that someone just put in a container. And if you're planting bare root, look at these. This was a community tree planting project. Their bare root trees came in. They were already leafed out. You cannot plant bare root trees that already have leaves on them. So once again, these trees return back to the nursery because you are not going to get these to survive. So any container material or any bare root material that is already leafed out, don't plant it. It's too late. And look at this. This was bare root material that was shipped in early July of last year. It had already leafed out. The community went ahead and planted it, and every one of them died. If those new leaves are exposed to temperatures in the 90s, while they're still tender, they wilt like this. Bare root is really limited to spring in the Dakotas. And it starts when we've got soil temperatures that are about 50 degrees, so roots will start to grow. And it's done when the buds start to expand. You've really got to have them established. Now, some trees are kept in coolers, and so you can delay that a little longer, but keep in mind, if you delay it a little bit longer and now you plant the tree in June and the temperatures are already in the 90s, consistently in the 90s, those leaves are going to dry out very quickly, and you're probably going to see mortality. And make sure the roots are healthy. One of the things I recommend for bare root is take your fingernails, scrape one of the roots. Should be white underneath, not brown. Sometimes they're not cared for properly and the roots dry out. And don't ever leave a bare root plant out like this. Those roots dry out very quickly, within 2 minutes. So it goes from its packing material to the pre-dug hole and planted within 2 minutes. Otherwise, some of those roots are going to desiccate. I might mention too, this last year we did see a mold problem on some bare root stock. Usually the mold in itself is not a problem. You can wash it off. But sometimes the mold is an indication that the plants were not stored properly. In other words, they were kept at too warm at temperatures in the cooler, kind of like milk being held at 50 degrees, kind of spoils. And unfortunately, some of these trees were lost. So if you're finding mold on your bare root material, first of all, let me know so I can check out the reason for it. But it's just a note of concern. Now, sometimes it's just surface mold, wash it off, plant the trees, and they're absolutely fine. In fact, I'd say that's the majority of the time. But we want to see what mold's on there just because we're aware of a issue sometimes with how they're being stored in the coolers. And then one I've absolutely got to mention for bare root, only bare root, is if it's a bare root oak, birch, hawthorn, or hackberry, those 4 trees, you really need to sweat them in order to get the buds to expand. Because what will happen is if you go out and just plant them, like you do your maples and your other trees, sometimes those buds will not open. They go from the shock from going from a cooler to warm spring temperatures and drier humidity, and they won't open up their buds. And if they don't open their buds, these 4, the roots won't begin to grow and the trees will die. So you do need to sweat them. And what's a sweating process? Well, like here, lay the plants down. I like a pole barn where you're keeping the temperatures, somewhere in the 50s and 60s, the normal temperatures that we get, but it's shaded, so that's protection. You lay the plants down, you cover the base of them in straw or mulch, just something that'll hold moisture. Wood chips are fine too. And then you cover the entire plant, roots and top, in plastic that you hold to the ground or to the concrete. And what you've created is a little humidity chamber. And so the conditions are kind of not as good as in the cooler because it's a little bit warmer. It's not quite as humid, but it's cooler and more humid than it is outside. And you do that for a few days and the buds will start to expand and then you can plant them. In fact, you have to plant them almost immediately. Now, if you say, John, I've only got 2 or 3 trees, or I don't have the time, or I have a bunch of seedlings, there is another way you can sweat them, and that is simply put them in water. The roots, that is. You get a bucket of water, stick the roots in the water, keep them in the water for about 24 hours, no more than 30, and pull them out. You've essentially achieved the same process. So if you say, John, I'm planting about 5 or 6 little oaks or birch or that, just take the bundle, stick them in water, do that for about a day and a half, and you're ready to plant them, and you've broken that sweating cycle as well. And it's much simpler than trying to cover them up in plastic. All right, like I said, we're going to spend a lot of time on this one. Improper planting, and 3 words describe it: planting too deep. It's one of the biggest killers of trees in our region and almost anywhere else in the United States. Actually, it's a global issue. And this tree here is a green ash that was being planted a number of years ago before emerald ash borer was really known. And when I went out and looked at the site, I knew what the problem was. Its trunk is going straight into the ground. Well, it's going straight in the ground like this. I already know you planted it too deep because there ought to be a flare at the base. And when I dug around this particular tree, it was planted 6 inches too deep. Now, that sometimes is not an immediate killer. The trees will linger for a decade or more But then I go out to your house. I'm looking at a tree. It's been in the ground 15 years. It's not growing as well as it should. You wonder what you need to spray. And I look at the base and it's going straight into the ground. And I dig and I find the proper planting depth at about 6 to 8 inches below the ground, and it's too late to correct. So what you need to do is plant your trees so that the highest root is just beneath the soil surface. The highest root is just beneath the soil surface. Doesn't matter if I'm planting a seedling or a larger tree. And if you're planting an ornamental or a fruit tree, those trees are grafted. In other words, we've taken the roots of one plant, stuck a single bud of the cultivar we want, whether it's a Haralson apple or a fall Fiesta sugar maple, and the new tree grows from that bud. And we always graft them above ground, not below ground. So you see this? That shows you the graft, doesn't it? Any ornamental tree or any fruit tree that goes in the ground, other than evergreens, of course, I should be able to see that crook. If that crook is buried, you've planted it too deep. So that crook shows where it was grafted. Below it is the stock, what we used to call the root stock. Above it is the sign. That's the cultivar that you wanted. And that, so if it goes straight in the ground there and you planted an ornamental tree or a fruit tree, you already know it was in too deep. Now you can correct it 1 year after planting, but not 5, 10, 15 years after planting. So there's nothing more important when you're in that planting process than getting it at the right depth. The highest root is just beneath the soil surface, and that crook on your ornamental trees or fruit trees is clearly visible. I thought you might find this one interesting. I took that picture in 2005. In fact, it was in the pest alert in 2005. And what you're looking at is 3 Crimson King Norway maples up in Britton, South Dakota. And they had been planted a couple of years beforehand. So they'd already been in the ground for a couple of years. And the call I got was, how come the one on the end is so much shorter than the one at this end? And the one in the middle is kind of in between, but closer to the first one. Well, guess what? The 2 furthest from you here, the 2 furthest to the left, they were planted too deep. I mean, I had to dig down to find the crook, which means they were planted way too deep. The one to the right, it was planted almost right. It was still a little too deep, but only a little too deep. And you can see, you already see the difference in growth among these 3 plants. Well, I went back and looked at that site in 2020. And you know what? The trees are still there. But, and you can see that the 2 are still stunted. Like I say, planting too deep doesn't always mean the tree dies. It just means it never really grows. Now, again, these are Crimson Kings in Britain, and that's kind of at the limits of its plant hardiness. So none of them are going to become huge trees, but you can see the one that was closest to getting it right is still the largest. And if you look at the other 2, quite honestly, they're not much taller than they were 15 years earlier. And I've got a couple trees on campus the exact same way. They went in the ground. They were planted too deep. I'm not in charge of all the planting here. But you know what? I use them for showing students. There's trees that have been in the ground for almost 20 years and they've barely grown. Trunk's a little bit bigger. They're hanging in there, but they were planted too deep. So if there's one thing you absolutely want to get correct, it's the planting depth. Planting bare root, that's easier to do because you can see the hole that's dug here about 3 times larger than the root system. And you can clearly see the uppermost root. So it's pretty easy to make sure you've got that just beneath the soil surface. And obviously you can see the crook above that. I might add, when you're planting that bare root tree, make sure the roots are nice and wet as they go in. All right. Don't plant them if they're dry yet. Make sure you soak them and then put it into the soil. And it's a good opportunity to cut off any broken roots. And by the way, if you've got one root that just goes out forever, just cut it off. Don't worry about it. Just one root. Don't make the entire tree fit the hole. You might have to dig the hole wider. But again, if it's just one root, cut it cleanly and you're fine. Where we see more of a problem is with container trees, and that's the most popular way to plant these days. First of all, if you're going to grow a container tree, make sure you've dug the hole 3 times larger diameter than the container itself. Okay. And no deeper. In fact, if anything, dig the hole shallower than the container, because you know what? They come too deep in the container and you're going to have to pull some of that soil away from the top. My rule of thumb is dig the hole 3 times wider, about half as deep as the depth of the container, and you'll have it just about right. If you plant it at the same depth it was in the container, you've just planted it too deep. Notice that when you go out shopping this spring. You'll be buying ornamental trees or fruit trees, and you're going, well, where's the crook? The crook is buried in the container. And in that light, porous soil of the container, it's aerated enough, they do just fine that way, but not when you take them home. So you can see the uppermost root, it's been pulled away, so you can see that in this picture. And so make sure you've dug the hole wide, not deep. And by the way, you're putting the same soil in there that you took out. Don't add peat, don't add cow manure, don't add good topsoil. Put the same soil in that you pulled out. You might say, why am I even doing this? You're doing it because by digging it up and putting it back in once you've got the plant in, you've broken up that soil. All right, you haven't changed the texture, it's still the same percentage sand, silt, and clay, but you've broke it up. You changed the structure. So it's going to be a little bit more aerated, and that's going to help that tree penetrate out from the container soil. So here we have the container. Everything's out. You notice that they're pulling away the soil at the top until they can find that uppermost root, and that'll determine the planting depth as we're having here. The other thing they've got to do is notice the roots are going around, and that's the real problem with containers. That when the root hits the side of the container, it's going to start spinning, and you've got to correct that before you plant it. Notice this one. Look at that. You don't even want to buy that plant. It's almost, you can't even correct it anymore. There's so much of it. I always recommend tap the pot in the garden center, the one you want to buy. Don't just do this to every pot. Tap it and try to pull it up just a little bit. Let them know you're going to do that just because you want to see the root system. And if it looks like this, set it back down and walk on. That's going to be a hard one to correct, because what's going to happen is those roots keep going around and they become girdling roots. This can take 15 years to kill a tree, and in 15 years, it will kill the tree. But if you planted it from a container and didn't break up those sides, those roots will continue to circle. And if you planted it too deep, now the root is going to come in contact with the stem. And when that happens, it'll girdle the stem and the tree will die. And this often takes 15 years. Now, sometimes it can happen a lot faster. Look at this. Aaron Keyes, city forester from Aberdeen, took this picture. This is a discovery elm. Now, discovery elm is a fast-growing tree. And when they planted it, somebody forgot to take care of the circling roots. And this is only a few years later. The tops were dying in the trees. They started pulling them up, and look at those girdling roots. They can grow that fast on some of our fast-growing trees. Well, how do you take care of it? Now, first thing, you don't buy the tree if there's a lot of circling roots going around. But almost any tree you buy, there will be some. And if it's only some, you can take care of the problem. Now, this will not take care of the problem. What you're seeing here is the gentleman here is doing what we had an old technique, and that's quartering the ball, as it was called. That he's going to take that saw and slice it in 4 quarters. And the idea is that the root that you cut will now send out shoots going outward. It will not. This is an absolute waste of time and will not correct the problem. Don't split the ball or make vertical slashes as you're seeing here. Instead, shave it. Pull the soil ball out. It's solid enough it should hold together, as long as it's not a containerized tree that was just a bare root tree that was just put in the pot. But if it's container grown, that soil contains enough roots, it'll hold together. Take a sharp spade and cut off about 1/2 inch all the way around. Shaving the ball is a term that's used a lot in the South. Boxing is a term used more in the North. I hear that frequently said in Minnesota, for example. Well, we're going to box all our trees. What that means is they pulled them out of their pot and they're going to slice all the way around about 1/4 to 1/2 inch. And then what you've done is all the roots now are facing out, not in or around. And you'll actually get a very good root system developing. So it's actually very easy to do. Use the back side of the shovel or the spade and work your way all the way around and then plant the tree. The last thing, notice how I've planted this tree. It's planted just slightly high. Notice that? We did get all the loose soil at the top of the pot gone. You can clearly see the crook where it was grafted. You can even see the uppermost root there. But I've still got it setting a little high. And now all we're going to do is build soil out from it. Now, by planting it on a very slight berm, and by slight, I only mean a few inches. One, it's going to protect it a little bit from lawnmowers, because they're going to have to go up a slope a little bit to hit it. Gives you the perfect area where you're going to put mulch so the lawnmowers stay away from it, as well as the grass whips. And it actually provides a little bit better drainage. Water should always run away from the base of a tree, even a small tree. And I know in the Dakotas, where water is a luxury, we often think we want to dish it so the water will run to it. But we drown more trees than we dry out. So always have it sloped slightly so that if I pour water at the base of the tree, it's going to slowly run off that base rather than pool at the base. There's a couple of other ways you can buy trees. This is a grow bag. It's kind of an interesting container. It's an in-ground container. That's a fabric container. They put the tree in at the nursery, and they grow it at the nursery in this bag. Now, the bag is set in the ground. So if you actually went out to the nursery, you might not even realize that every tree you're looking at in the row is actually its own little bag. The roots just really don't grow out of the bag, just very fine ones do. It's a great way to grow trees. When you get it home, you have to remove the grow bag entirely. Otherwise, you'll stunt the tree. It's a good way to grow trees. It's not a good way to maintain trees. And so I have people, they forget about this, and 5 years later, their tree is no bigger than it was. And you find out, oh, you forgot to remove the grow bag. So don't hesitate to buy these trees. In fact, you actually get a superior plant, a much better root system than container. But just remember, when you get it home, after you've dug the hole, take that entire bag away as you're putting it in the hole, or cut the bag away once it's in the hole. But make sure you get that base out as well. And we still have some planting that's done balled in burlap, often referred to as B&B. This was much more popular back in the 70s and 80s. I don't see a lot of stock sold this way. We've kind of gone just to containers. But B&B is actually a better way to plant a tree than from a container. Why? The container soil is nothing like the soil in your yard. You don't have yard soil like that. But the somewhat heavy clay soil that's used for nurseries that are growing B&B, that's closer to your yard, so there's not a great shift in soils or soil texture. And so I still like to buy B&B trees if you can find them. Bare roots really the best because there's no change in soil texture. And the worst is container because there's tremendous change in soil texture. B&B kind of splits the difference. And in larger stock, it's a good way to go. but there are a couple of tips we need to cover for planting these. First of all, they come too deep in the basket. I know that sounds surprising, but when they harvest them at the nursery, they oftentimes put soil around them. And so if you say, well, I'm going to plant it at the same depth that it came in as this ball, you've put it in too deep. This was about 800 trees that had been planted in South Dakota, all evergreens, all spruce, I might add. And they called me in because they were just dying. Well, I looked at the base and there were literally branches coming out of the ground. Well, you know, they had been balled and basketed too deep. And so I pulled everything off of the tree you're looking at right now, everything off away from that tree. Look at that. It was 6 inches too deep in the basket. So remember the idea with containers. Don't dig the hole as deep as the container. Don't dig the hole as deep as your B&B ball. You know, kind of look at the base, pull a little bit away, see if it's going straight in the ground and get some idea of how deep it is. And then when you plant it, dig the hole that much shallower and pull everything away once it's in the hole, of course, rather than doing this. But on this basket, here's what you absolutely need to remove. You need to remove that string around the base. It's nylon, and that'll kill a tree in 10 years as it grows. You always want to pull away the burlap at the top of the ball. Why? It's actually hydrophobic. If you pour water on it, it'll run off. And then cut away the top of the wire basket. You don't have to remove the entire wire basket if you want. What a lot of people will do is they will slide the tree into the hole, because remember, that basket and burlap is holding that ball together. And then once it's in the hole, they'll cut away the nylon, they'll pull back, rip or tear the burlap, and then they use wire cutters and cut away the top of the wire basket, but leave the ones at the base. It does not girdle the roots. It does not girdle the roots. So no fear of that. But you do want to remove the top of the wire basket, more for convenience than anything else. Look at this tree. You see that yellow dashed line around it? That was the size of the basket, the metal basket. And here's a close-up. The metal was still above ground. That's a good trip hazard. As well as if you ground out that stump, you're going to cut through metal. So again, dig the hole 3 times wider, not quite as deep as the ball. Roll the entire tree into the hole, because that basket and burlap and twine will hold the ball together. Once you've got it properly seated, okay, pull away the burlap at the top. Hopefully you now have the depth just where you wanted it, because you checked that before. Pull away any of the nylon, cut away the upper 2/3 of the entire wire basket, and you're done. The burlap on the side will just rot. It'll stay wet and it'll completely disappear. The wire basket that's underneath will not cause any problem for the tree. And if you really want to do it right, take your B&B plant or your container plant, plant it bare root. Look what we did here. We took that B&B ball, we cut it entirely away and hosed it down. There's the entire root system that was in that B&B ball. You could pick it up in one hand. And now you don't have to dig the hole as deep. You're almost digging a trough or a pan to set it in. Do you see that string? That was at the top of the ball. Do you notice something? That crook is below that. It was too deep. If I can go backwards, it was too deep in that ball. Like I say, that happens all the time. Now you know exactly where the planting depth ought to be, and the ball is not that big. You're looking at the entire ball, and now you just soak it. But think of that. Right where you see that string was at the top of the ball. Had you planted it in the ball at that depth, you'd have planted it too deep. So all they've done is washed everything away and place it in the hole. One person can hold it and just keep watering as you go. You don't have to dig the hole as deep either. And so I like doing this. It's taking, you can do it with container trees as well. Just remove all the soil. We do it in midsummer and it works just fine as long as you keep it wet while you're planting, and you get a lot better success. And there we are, soaking it down and then staking it. And that brings us to our final problem, and that is improper aftercare. Too often trees are planted and then trees are ignored. In fact, you know, for community tree planting events, I don't really care how many people they can get out to plant trees. What I care about is how many are they going to get back to water the trees. And quite often the maintenance is forgotten. So let's talk about the lack of aftercare. First of all, we do need to stake trees, as you saw the last one. South Dakota and North Dakota are known for their wind. It's continual. It's not if it's windy, it's how windy it is. And so we do need to stake quite often for that first year, at least landscape trees. And the two stakes should be perpendicular to the prevailing wind. Okay. Stake should not bind. Staking should not bind. Notice this is that canvas. It's not going to bind those trunks at all. Don't attach it any higher than 2/3 the height. You attach it too high, the tree isn't going to be able to sway in the wind, and it has to be able to sway slightly in the wind to have enough strength so that when you remove it, the tree doesn't fall over. And you're removing it a year after planting. If it can't support itself after a year, well, you got another problem. All right, it just wasn't a healthy tree. But two stakes perpendicular, prevailing wind. Use a staking that doesn't bind. I like this canvas ribbon here. That works well. Do not use rubber hose and wire. That will damage the trunk. Don't attach it too high and don't leave it on too long. Should be taken off the following spring. And then mulch. About a 6-inch layer of coarse mulch. Try to leave a space about 6 inches bare right next to the trunk. Why? Well, that keeps the little voles and other critters away, or at least helps. And it's going to fill in a little bit. And you know what the best mulch to get? Next time you see a tree service driving down the road and they got a chipper behind it, grab those chips. There's no better mulch for trees than what just came out of a chipper. It's got shredded twigs, shredded bark, shredded wood, shredded leaves. It's perfect. Yes, and it's fresh, and you can lay that down as long as you don't put it in the soil. And if you can put about a 6-inch layer down there and put it out as far as you want, I like it to go at least beyond the planting hole, which again is 3 times wider than the root system. That's a great start for a tree. And if you want to remove it 5 years later and have grass up to the trunk, go ahead. But in the beginning, I want that dedicated space just for the tree. And I want to keep a cooler, moisture environment for the tree to grow. No mulch volcanoes. Don't bury the base with mulch. You know, there's 2 problems with that. There's several, but there's 2. Do you know roots can actually come up and start growing in there, and you can actually create an environment for circling roots that'll girdle the trunk? And you created it by piling mulch that high. The other is, if it is fresh mulch and you pile it too high, it'll compost and you can actually get heat injury to the trunk. So no mulch volcanoes, 6 inches, that's it. And try to clear a little space right around the base of the tree. Here's a bad example, a good picture of a bad example. Look at how that mulch has been piled up, and it's just, you're burying the trunk. Don't do that. I don't like to see fabric used. Now, I like fabric for windbreaks, but for your ornamental trees in your yard, dig up the sod, pull that away, put mulch on that. But if you put it at least 6 inches, quite honestly, if it was a lawn, I'd put 8 inches of mulch. You want to put thick enough mulch that you're not going to get weeds coming up through it. Fabric, if you leave it there, can girdle trees. This is actually an Amur maple down at Dakota Dunes. And the tree was dying. Why? The fabric was embedded in the trunk of the tree. You couldn't even pull it out. And so fabric for windbreaks, absolutely, under proper management. Fabric for ornamental trees in the yard, no. Planting beds, sure, go ahead. Put that tree out in your yard, pull the sod off, lay down mulch, just make sure it's deep enough that it'll smother any weeds trying to come up through. All right, the other thing is watering. And statewide, we're all getting nervous. It looks like a drought. So a couple rules on watering. First of all, general rule of thumb is a gallon of water for every inch caliper. Okay, for every inch diameter. And you want to water it daily for 2 weeks, then every other day for the rest of the month, assuming it hasn't rained. That's the best aftercare you can give a tree. And you might say, well, what do we mean by caliper? I'll show you. Caliper's measured about 6 inches from the base of the tree. So the trunk diameter of the base of the tree, all right, about 6 inches up, trunk diameter there is where we measure caliper. And if you bought a 1-inch caliper tree, that's where it was measured. 1-inch caliper tree, 1 inch, 1 gallon each watering. Okay. And you want to add a lot of water in the beginning, but you want to do it frequently. That's why I say on here, daily for 2 weeks. Now, if it rains, you're done. But the problem is, if you say, well, what if I just add 7 gallons at the end of the week? Most of that water is going to run off. It's not going to be absorbed. So daily, if you can. And the closer you can get to that schedule, the better. And if you say, John, I'm putting in a windbreak, how about seedlings? Seedlings, anywhere between a pint and a quart of water at planting. Absolutely. And if you could do a quart or a pint every day for 2 weeks, that's really going to help those seedlings too. And I realize that's very difficult to do in windbreak conditions, but I can't tell you, that makes more benefit than almost anything else you can do. And by the way, fertilizer is not a substitute for watering. I get people that do this. I like this. And these are Meyer spruce that were planted as kind of a windbreak. And what he has is a bucket next to it, a bucket with a brick in it, because the bucket will blow away. And he's got a nail hole there. You know what he does? He fills that bucket with water, lets it slowly drain, and it's perfect. And then, you know, every few days he refills the bucket, because the bucket will hold more than a gallon of water for this tree. And that's a great way to water. Or, not easy to do for homeowners, and not inexpensive to do for windbreaks, but I love trickle irrigation. Look at these trees. Look at that lawn area. It's dead. It's in a drought. Well, it'll come back, but who really cares? You know, they do have their fabric down. Fabric is getting overgrown in places. But you look at the spruce, you look at the lilacs, they're all great. And you can see the hose for the trickle irrigation. And I asked the guy, I said, what do you do? He says, well, ever since I went in during the growing season, I'm going to water each plant 2 gallons an hour for 12 hours a week. And he did it about 3 times a week. So think of this, about 4 hours each time and 2 gallons per hour. Wow. I mean, these plants were getting water, not too much water, just the right amount of water. And look at the growth. If you don't water, don't be surprised if the plants don't grow. Watering is key. Well, I did want to finish on time here. We started about 4 minutes late. My apologies for that. I knew it'd be close, but it was a little bit closer than I expected. But I did want to leave time for questions. Now, before we do that, and I let Tony moderate for that if there are any questions. But first of all, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you participating today. There is my phone number and email if you have any questions on this, either later on today or next week on planting. Give me a holler. And if you're an ISA certified arborist. And this only applies if you're an International Society of Arboriculture certified arborist. And as Tony mentioned earlier, watching this live, here's your CEU credit. First of all, you have to call it spring planting. Reason why is ISA looks at that as well, not just the code. And if you called this something different than what we called it on the form submitted to ISA, they may not give you credit. So you would call it spring planting, which is the name we gave to ISA, and your code is DS, okay, for Dakotas, dash 24 dash 008. And so you self-report, you can send it in, but remember it's for the live one. So I would send it in this week. So you have that, and then you've got another credit towards your ISA certification. So I'll turn it back to Tony now while we've got at least 5 minutes or so. Tony, do we have any questions, or the chat box just for where people are and what certification they need?
Well, we do have a lot of people chiming in on the location. Over 90 people joined us today. Thank you, everybody, from at least 4 states.
Wow.
I do have a handful of questions too. I
Okay.
guess we'll start at the beginning. That's always a good spot. Wood mulch lasts until the next wind, in Mark's opinion. What's another option for putting around the base of a tree?
Okay. You know, Mark, that's a good point. Now, by the way, I would disagree with you on mulch coming right out of a chipper, because that has twigs and bark pieces and all sorts of other stuff. And it does tend to hold much better. We use it on campus and we get wind. If you're just using wood chips, you're right. That's going to be in the next county. Excuse me, people. What I say next is going to surprise people. You can use rock. Wash River rock works out extremely well, particularly on poorly drained soils. So if you say, well, I do need to use a mulch, and I will say this, if you're using a rock mulch, you're going to have to use fabric because you're not piling it that high. But I know a lot of people say, well, I thought we couldn't use rock. No, we can. Wash River rock works out fairly well, and on poorly drained soils, it works out fairly good. You can also use the bark nuggets you can buy at garden centers. Those tend to get expensive, but they don't blow quite as much. But he's absolutely right. If it's a wood chip, it's going to carry. If it's right out of the back of a chipper where you have the shredded leaves and twigs and large bark pieces and everything in between, that tends to hold fairly well. But valid point. Next.
Next question. I'm going to combine 2 questions here. Do you recommend watering bare root trees that were planted last spring for this season? Do they need to be watered? And what are your thoughts on gator bags for watering? You know, those 20-gallon bags that you slap up on the base of a tree.
You know, I had those gator bags. I actually had one in the presentation and took it out because most people are aware of them. Gator bags work great, kind of like putting that little tub, you know, a little bucket next to the tree with a hole in it. Same principle. Water's going to slowly drain in. Excuse me. But I'll say this, gator bags only work if you can put water in the gator bag. And I see too often that they're just lying on the ground or they blow away because they don't have the water to hold them. But otherwise, no, they're fantastic because they provide a little bit water over a longer time period. In terms of watering trees for 2 years, if you were in a drought area last year, and it's probably going to be in a drought area this year, absolutely. If you can water 2 years, particularly bare root trees, that's going to be a real benefit. Less so for bald and burlap, even to container to a degree. But for bare root, please, if you can continue watering this year, but this year maybe once a week. They've got an established root, so not quite as much. But it'll help, and I'm afraid we may be in a drought across the state this year.
Dr. Ball, how about the best way to protect from deer?
Other than firearms, if it's a ornamental tree, you know, you've seen it out in the hills, Tony. People taking 3 T-posts and then putting a metal cage all the way around the trees during the winter, some cases during the summer. And that's really about it. You can use deer repellent, but it has to be used before the deer are used to the area. If they're already used to coming through, it will not repel them anymore. If it's for smaller stock, such as bare root seedlings and that, tube them. I'm a big fan of putting a tube around the trees. These are for the seedlings that go into windbreaks. But I'll tell you this, the tube has to be 5 feet. Don't buy the 4-foot tubes. Deer will nibble the tops and you'll never get a tree. You'll get a little lollipop. 5-foot tubes, they seem to be able to grow out of and start getting some height before the deer get to them.
Looks like I have 2 more questions here, one from Walter,
Okay.
one from Dan. These will be our last 2 for the day. Any tips for planting in the heavy red clay soil?
Yeah. I will tell you, I like bare root in that condition. And the reason why is there's no change in soil texture. I know it sounds terrible because you look at those soils, but your best bet is planting a tree in those soils and nothing else, nothing around it. And you might say, but oh my gosh, the soil's so tough. What's it going to do when it gets out of it? Well, it's going to get out of that hole the first year. So you're better off getting it started in that same soil. So bare root, I really like in those sort of soils. Container would be your worst option. That change in soil texture is so different. Or buy the container, wash all the soil away, and then plant it in that soil.
And Dan says he's replacing about 100 trees in a windbreak in the last year, and they have fabric and drip irrigated. Since they planted through a fabric, what are your thoughts on using an auger to drill the holes and then using a blade or rebar to scar the sides of that cylindrical hole to prevent the circling roots?
You certainly could do that. What he's describing is augering, which in itself is not always a good idea because the auger can glaze the side of the holes almost like clay and the roots don't penetrate out of it. So he added that all important second step, and that was breaking up the sides of it. And then I'm absolutely fine. We will auger holes on campus here, but we do that second step and we break up that glazing around the edge too. And it's a great way to plant a tree, but make sure it's still wide enough that the roots are not circling, that you didn't do such a small auger that you're almost twisting the roots in like a light bulb. Otherwise, nope, that's a great way to plant.
Well, I had a couple more questions trickle in, Dr. Ball, if you got the time.
We got a minute or two. Let's do it.
Surely. Doak asks, what is your opinion on the fibrous root systems of trees produced by Forrest Keeley Nursery out of Missouri?
I don't want to talk about particular nurseries, and let me preface that by saying it's not because I have anything negative to say about this nursery. I do not. But the more fibrous root system, the better. And some nurseries are very good at even growing trees that have tap roots, typically have tap roots, so very little roots to them, and being able to manage them so they have a fiber. So let me just make this clear. No matter where you're buying your nursery stock from, the more fibrous, the more fine it is, the better establishment you're going to get.
Now, Paul asks, what are your observations for trees and shrubs, their performance when they've been irrigated from planting young, and then that irrigation is removed in a few years? He's curious if we're creating a temporary artificial environment that has trained the root growth to not be sustainable later in the plant's life.
No, I mean, you are making a valid point. It's like letting your kids live in the basement until they're 30 and then kicking them out on the street. They're not adapted to live on their own. But the point of this one is you're irrigating fairly heavily that first year because they don't really have a root system. The next year, you're cutting back on that irrigation, maybe once a week. And then the final year, if you're still irrigating, even less than that. So it's a gradual change. You are absolutely correct. If you water at the same regime for 3 years in a row and shut off the water then, you are really going to stunt those trees because, as you said, they've adapted to that environment. And so it's a little bit of tough love that you want to keep irrigating so that you're providing a little additional water to allow them to continue to grow, but not so much water that they're becoming dependent on this artificial system. So thank you for that comment, because hopefully everybody understands that, and that's very clear. We are doing a little bit of tough love after the first year, and we're reducing the frequency so that the root system continues to expand and a tree adapts to what will be its normal life. And that is, sooner or later, there is no supplemental watering, and you are dependent on what the rain gives you.
And I think that ties well into this next question. How much are we watering mature trees like evergreens that are 15 years and older? And I think you just kind of answered it.
I think I did. And that is, you're probably not. Now, if they're in your yard, you're watering them when you water your lawn, and that they're going to benefit from that. But I think this gets back to almost the very beginning, and that is choose trees and shrubs that are adapted to our climate, that not only do we have hot summers and very cold winters, but we can go from feast or famine for water too, that it can be excessively wet and excessively dry. And we do have trees that can tolerate that. In fact, we plant a lot of them. Green ash was a great choice. American elm was a great choice. We don't plant them because of their problems, but we do have others. But we also have trees that are not very well adapted to that sort of environment, and that would include many of our Freeman maples, that you are probably going to be watering those trees a little bit in order to have them continue to grow as they mature. Bur oak, nope. 3 years, tough love. They're on their own, and they'll actually do very nicely. And many of the other trees as well. So I'm really not looking at watering when the trees are the age that you mentioned, Tony, or size.
And looks like we have one more here in the chat. Angie asks, she always thought that leaving container soil, the soil that you get in the container from the nursery, helps the plant adjusting to the new soil. But can you explain why it is better to plant them with soil from the site instead of that nursery soil?
Okay, that'll be a good question to end on, and it's an actually well, they're all good questions, but that's a very good one. And here's the problem: it's the change in soil texture, that the container soil has a lot of organic material in there. It is very porous. It drains extremely well. It's not anything like the soil in your yard. So when you plant the tree and you have the soil, your native soil put in around it again, you're going to find that if you water that soil, the soil in the container soil dries out, because water will not move from the surrounding soil into the container soil because of the change in soil texture. So you'll literally dry them out until they start pushing roots out into the surrounding soil. So here's a tip, people. If you are planting them in the container soil and you're leaving the container soil, for that first week or two, make sure you have the hose right next to the base of the plant. Why? Because that's where all the roots are. And if you just water the sides, what's going to happen is that potting soil will dry out. Now, Angie, if you wanted to, as you're planting that shrub in its container soil, if you start breaking it up so that right around that container soil, you have kind of a mix of the container soil and your native soil, that's a fine transition as well. But if it's just container soil and your surrounding soil, that container ball will dry out first, because water will not move from the surrounding soil into the container soil.
Very well. That looks like all the questions. Thank you, Dr. Ball, for your time. Thank you, everybody, for your participation and for joining us today. Please join us next month. Dr. Ball, April will be which topic?
Oh, well, April's going to be our annual EAB topic. So we're going to be talking about that across both states, emerald ash borer. But you know what? We're also going to touch upon pine wilt, which is devastating in South Dakota and just about ready to enter North Dakota, and even a little bit on spotted lanternfly for our southern. So we're going to call it the three sisters. All right. Emerald ash borer, pine wilt, and spotted lanternfly, all coming to you soon, or you're already there. So a little bit on identification, management, and treatments when needed.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Dr. Ball. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next month.